We've talked about dreams under management, goals under management, and now it's time for humans under management. More specifically, the virtual Humans Under Management Conference happening on the 8th of September with incredible speakers from around the world. I'm thrilled to be part of this event for those seeking better client outcomes, which, as a listener of the Innovating Advice Show, I know includes you, and am impressed by how affordable this event is for advisors and planners everywhere. We're talking about the cost of a dinner. These super early bird tickets have sold out, but hop on now to grab an early bird ticket at innovatingadvice.com/HUM for Humans Under Management.
I think when we start getting into things such as equality, someone's right to exist, and someone's unique identity, those are no longer political issues, but those are human issues. And so I understand that change is hard from generation to generation. I think that's something that we as humans do, is we kind of pass judgment on the next generation and say, oh, those young whippersnappers. But I think that being willing to have an open mind and to hold a concept in your mind without necessarily saying, I believe this, but at least giving it thought is a perfect place to start in examining these things. And it also gives room to other realities to exist.
Welcome to episode 58 of the Innovating Advice Show. I'm joined by Cait Howerton, who is a CFP professional, accredited financial counselor, and LGBTQ+ financial and social advocate. In this episode, Cait and I are talking through the evolving language and terminology used in the LGBTQ community and how financial services professionals can be more inclusive to LGBTQ colleagues and clients. Cait helps us understand the important differences in saying women and men versus female and male, and the impacts of gender norms. She also walks us through how to review and shift the language we use on forms, documents, and websites to be more inclusive. And while Cait is working diligently to help create a future where no one is denied access to financial services on the basis of their asset levels, race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, disability, etc., we focused this episode on the LGBTQ community because it can be a challenging and uncomfortable topic, and it starts with increasing our understanding and opening the conversation. Links, show notes, and timestamps at innovatingadvice.com or directly through the link below. You're listening to the Innovating Advice Show, and I'm your host, Cait Holmes, bringing you the global pulse on financial services innovation, featuring financial planners, financial advisors, and related professionals from all corners of the globe. Let's dive in. Hi, Cait. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me today. Or I should say tonight.
Tonight, today, this afternoon. It's happy hour here. I know it's that time.
It's always 5 o'clock somewhere.
It is. So a little background, Cait, because I was thinking back to sort of how this started. You've been on my list for a long time. We both serve on CFP Board's Women's Initiative Council, and we had our meeting earlier this year. And during that, there was a lot of talk about bringing more females into the profession, of making room for more females. And you kind of chimed in and you said, hey, we need to make sure we're using the right language, and we should be saying women and not female. And since then, I've seen more and more pronouns being listed on social media. There have been conversations and actions with certification and membership organizations changing the questions that they ask. So I realized, this is time for a conversation that we should be having at the global level. It's coming up globally. So I'm so thrilled and honored to have you here. I'm going to be learning right along with the listeners throughout this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And truthfully, even as a member of the LGBTQ community, I'm always continually learning as well. So we'll do this journey together.
That sounds perfect. So let's start then with your journey coming into the profession of being an LGBTQ+ financial planner.
Absolutely. So, like many that made their way into financial planning, I likewise was a career changer. I started into the profession sometime around the point that I was around 25. And I was like, all right, Cait, it's time to get serious about, quote unquote, what do you want to be when you grow up? And what I knew is that I really enjoyed helping people figure out financial issues that they faced. I really enjoyed helping people understand their budgets and debt payoff and what a 401k plan is. And so I was like, well, I should explore this. And so as I started looking into financial planning, I found, truthfully, there was a lot of good advice and then not so good advice.
Yes.
And at that point, I discovered the AFCPE and I pursued my accredited financial counselor certification. So I kind of took a route into financial planning that a lot of planners don't. And first, I worked with non-affluent clients. I wanted to understand the full breadth of finances and what makes you good and what are some of the things that don't necessarily make you bad at finances, but that can get you into pickles. And really started exploring what's next. How do I get into financial planning and wealth management? And I knew that I wanted to work for some sort of fiduciary and preferably a fee only planner. So I knew that meant I would most likely wind up with an RIA or with a fintech. At the time, there weren't as many fintechs that had emerged yet that were hiring. And so for me, being located in the Southeast United States, I knew it would be a tough go being LGBTQ because there were so many firms that were predominantly Caucasian as well as predominantly men who worked for the firms or owned them. And I started interviewing and came across a couple of positions, was called in to interview. And, close to the end of the interview, the gentleman told me, Cait, you'd be I think that you'd be great. Your qualifications are wonderful, but I don't really think that you're going to align with our, with our niche and with our clientele. I was like, oh, okay. And so, that was one of those microaggressions where, as an LGBTQ person, you've had forms of that conversation happen along the way, in and outside of business that you knew it was because of who you were and how you identified. Eventually, I did find a firm that was it was a fintech located in Atlanta, Georgia, and they're incredibly diverse, minority owned, truthfully very focused on bringing financial guidance to the middle class. And I joined and, didn't look back.
That's awesome. But during that, microaggression, what is the message that you heard? I mean, how did it kind of translate into your brain when he said, I just don't think you're going to resonate with our clients?
Yeah, I mean, so it's one of those for me because of coming from a community where being LGBTQ plus was not okay. It was something that I truthfully had almost expected, but the message that I most carried with me was, is there a place for me in financial planning? Will I actually be able to find a job where I can work as a financial planner and be out and serve clientele where they can also be their own unique, authentic selves? And it was something that I was very concerned about. And truthfully, I almost left before I even really got started into financial planning. I was almost like, well, I have to go into another industry because this industry isn't diverse.
Well, thank you for staying and for sticking with it and for seeing that. I think that's one of the reasons you did stay. You're like, hey, I actually need to stay and become a role model to others because we absolutely need this profession internally to reflect the clients that we serve externally. So, you've done so much over the last few years in speaking up and being a voice. You've won diversity awards. You've been on podcasts and in the media, and, you're here with us today. So thank you for sticking through and for helping the rest of us become better, because I anticipate, when you were in that interview, that gentleman probably didn't mean anything by it. Right. And so that's the conversation we want to have today is, What are some of those unconscious biases that we hold? What are just ways that we can all learn and grow?
Yeah, absolutely. And, truthfully, I see our industry starting to evolve and change now. And I think these difficult conversations, these crucial conversations are where we have to begin. So I'm definitely excited to be a part of that, change and growth.
Good. So let's circle back to that conversation we had on the WIN Council and explain to us sort of the difference between women and female.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to actually read one of these definitions directly from the HRC. That's the Human Rights Campaign. And so I know that you said that prior to the call, you'd most likely include that in the show notes. So you guys will be able to go reference that there. But just so that because I'm not the end all be all, using this directly from a primary source. So your sex assigned at birth is essentially the sex, whether it be male, female, intersex, or even potentially other, given to a child at birth. And most of the time that's based on the external anatomy. At times that's also based on other things such as hormones, chromosomes, etc. But typically that's based upon the actual external anatomy versus using women, men, non-binary individuals, etc. That falls into the category of gender or even potentially gender identity. And so the HRC defines your gender identity as one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both or neither, and how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. So this gender identity can be the same or different from the sex assigned at birth.
So taking it sort of in its simplest terms, could we kind of say female or male for that matter is the medical definition, like you said, sort of assigned with your genitalia, and then women, man, or other is the gender identity.
That's right. That's right.
So one of the things, and this just came up yesterday, and I've linked to this in the show notes as well, because I just thought it was super timely, was an article in New Model Advisor in the UK. And it was a response to another article. And the situation at a high level was there was just an example in a textbook, basically, where it was talking about a couple splitting up and that it basically assumed that the person ending up with the smaller pension was a female. And somebody called it out on Twitter, no big deal, but it was just saying, hey, that's wrong from a number of levels. And I kind of want to dig into that because that gets into just unconscious biases around females or women being less than men. It gets into, assuming potentially that it's a heterosexual couple. Like there's so many things that are going on there. And I want to say one of the reasons this conversation is so important is because some of the comments in that original article was, oh, this is just snowflakery and everyone is so sensitive and, it's all political correctness. And, I always try to put myself in other people's shoes, whether I agree with them or not, and just try to see where they're coming from. And, whether I want to or not, I can appreciate people from different cultures or backgrounds or generations. But we need to change that conversation so that people understand why these words matter and why this language matters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's something that conversation it affects. Truthfully, that's one of the reasons that for those who identify as not within the LGBTQ community, this is a really important parallel to discuss why it's so important to understand the issues of those within the LGBTQ community, because some of these same issues affect women and men that are not in the LGBTQ community. So within that article, where they made the assumption that the smaller pension was of the female identifying partner, that's what we call it as a gender norm. And so gender norms really trap us into a place of a man does this and a woman does this, and a man makes more and a woman makes less, and all of these things. And truthfully, those norms establish some point within a society where we just accepted it as truth. I mean, not too long ago in American history, men wore wigs and tights. So
Right.
I think it's really, really important that we question, why do we believe this thing, and why is this thing tried and true? And is it that maybe we're just falling too much into a black and white area versus questioning what we do and what we believe and how we feel?
And so would you have any words to people that might be listening right now and thinking, okay, this is just another conversation on political correctness and everyone just wanting something to be upset by?
Yeah, and so as far as political correctness, I think politics is maybe an issue of, do we install a bridge down the road or do we not? I think when we start getting into things such as equality, someone's right to exist, and someone's unique identity, those are no longer political issues, but those are human issues. And so I understand that change is hard from generation to generation. I think that's something that we as humans do, is we kind of pass judgment on the next generation and say, oh, those, I mean, even like those young whippersnappers, but like, you know, such a very Southern phrase here in the United States, but
I
like,
love it.
I think that being willing to have an open mind and to hold a concept in your mind, without necessarily saying, I believe this, but at least giving it thought is a perfect place to start in examining these things. And it also gives room to other realities to exist. My best friend is the primary earner in her family, and she's married to a man, and he's the primary caregiver to their child. And for right now, he's also in school, and so it works for their family. It works. He loves taking care of his daughter, and he loves also having the opportunity to go to school. And so, by examining these little t truths that we believe, of what people should be, we're able to then say, what can we do a little differently? What can we give more space to?
Yeah, I love that. And that does happen so often. We just don't see it enough. Thankfully, we're starting to see it in the media a bit more, in, Hollywood and movies. And I think that definitely helps, because those are the messages that kids grow up with and that we start to see around ourselves. And I just want to, kind of circling back to the male, female, women, men, when it comes to financial services, whether we're talking about, hiring people internally, or, documents for clients to fill out, application forms or onboarding forms, are there situations where we should be using male, female? How should that language be used?
Ideally, ideally we would have the opportunity to expand upon our data collection, outside of just simply leaving it as sex, or sometimes it's used as gender, and that's technically would be the wrong question at that point. It should instead be sex instead of gender, question mark. And so we see that on forms, especially when it comes to insurance, estate planning, taxes, etc. I think first and foremost, we have to examine, why are we asking for this information? Is it truthfully, do we need it? And obviously, as financial planners and financial advisors, we know that we're going to have to collect that data along the way for one reason or another. So I think it's important for us to ask the right questions for the right time frame, until our processes at national levels and even at the global level changes to where we understand that the differences between sex and gender, and we offer more gender inclusive options through the IRS, or through the governing body that taxes or et cetera are paid to. We're still going to have to ask male or female, sex assigned at birth. But some of the other questions that can be used within just the general paperwork that a financial planner examines would be, do you consider yourself a member of the LGBTQ community? That will help you understand, are there other planning issues that may have to be taken into account? Some of which maybe within a state, if you have money being left down to family, and will there be probate issues? Will there be issues with the will? Is there going to be a lot of fighting
Yeah.
within the family? And then also just what is your gender? And you can give a couple of answers there, such as, you know, woman, man, non-binary, or even prefer to self-describe. And so those are those questions, excuse me, are incredibly helpful for just when you're putting that into your own paperwork, so that you're able to appropriately speak to the person that's across the table from you or across the Zoom camera. And then lastly is, you know, do you identify as transgender? This is an incredibly important question to ask, because there are a lot of medical issues that come with being transgender that a financial planner, and I typically don't try to say should, but a financial planner should be helping their client plan for. So that's something that's incredibly important to ask, because you may not necessarily know if they are transgender or cisgender.
So there's a lot that I want to unpack there, and a bit of it that we're going to repeat because I think a lot of it bears repeating because we're all learning on this journey. But
Absolutely.
on the cisgender, the first time I ever heard that term was actually on Bianca Dorsonville's 2050 Trailblazers podcast. And and she was like me on this podcast, like, hey, I'm learning along. I don't know what that means. So let's just pause. And what is cisgender?
Sure. So once again, I'll be referencing my handy dandy human rights
Perfect.
campaign glossary. And so what cisgender means is it's a term used to describe a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. So if you have, if you were born and your sex assigned at birth were to be female, and you still identify also as female, then you are cisgender. And if not, and if you've chosen to identify as a different sex assigned to you at birth, then you're transgender.
So would I just say I'm cisgender? Am I a cisgender female or a cisgender woman?
To be most inclusive, typically you would say a cisgender woman. I think that another aspect that I didn't necessarily speak to as far as female versus woman is that female is an adjective. I know we're really getting into grammar lessons,
Yeah.
guys. That could be a female dog, a female monkey, a female cat, and so a woman is that's held for, this is a member of the human species. So most of the time when we speak about those things, you probably say a cisgender woman.
Okay.
And this may be, if you guys are listening 6 months from now, this may be completely out of date. So it's always expanding.
Well, and speaking of, so I want to take a few minutes and dive into LGBTQ plus. And when I was thinking back, I mean, I had friends that were part of the I think it was just the LGB community at that time in the 90s. And then I moved away to Australia for a couple years. And I think when I came back, then there was a T, and then there was a Q, and then there was a plus. So it does keep expanding. And you and I were even chatting about, I guess now the young whippersnappers coming up next, and evolving it even further. But, let's take a moment to dive into that, because it is important to acknowledge that it is changing. And you said that in the beginning, all we can really do is all do our best to be open and inclusive and understand where things are at now and how we can best be allies to everyone. And, so thinking back, it was LGB in the 90s, lesbian, gay, and bisexual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, I mean, now the LGBTQ, there's LGBTQIA squared at one point, and then finally they were just like, okay, it's LGBTQ plus, and that's plus is just inclusive of, just a whole gamut of identities. But as far as those that are most commonly associated, it would be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. Within that, there's also intersex, there's asexual, etc. And one of the things that, as far as this acronym, it's beneficial, but it can also be damaging, because something that I think people outside of the LGBTQ community can can assume is that we're all the same. Just as, people who live on the East Coast in the United States are typically fairly different from those that live on the West Coast. There's so many variances between each of those acronyms. So I think it was something to be a catch-all from everyone who's different from a cisgender heterosexual person when that acronym came out. And so now it's just this vast collective for anyone who's just a little bit different.
And, thinking back to, growing up in Seattle, we've always been very progressive there. And, I remember it was often referred to as the gay community, but like you said, it's just much more inclusive now. So would the right terminology, you've used it a couple times, be the LGBTQ community?
I think it's the LGBTQ community, and actually within academic spaces, they academics are now actually referring to it as the queer community. Queer at one point was actually used as a derogative word. It was used against the community. Over the course of time, there's been a reclamation. I might not be saying that word correctly. Yeah. Term. And what's nice about the queer community is it's comprehensive. That essentially is everyone who's in this full gamut of the LGBTQ plus community can identify as queer. And that's at least, I think, for academics are kind of trying to stamp it of saying like, all right, guys, you guys have a term. It's now you're all part of this, a part of this community, and everyone's included. So either way, LGBTQ plus or queer.
And I'm just looking on because I've got the Human Rights Campaign glossary up here as well, because I wanted to see. So under queer, it's a term people often use to express fluid identities and orientations, often used interchangeably with LGBTQ. Mm-hmm. So yeah, kind of saying that catch-all. And so I, thinking back, I think I'm probably thinking of the time where, queer was maybe more derogatory. So that's sort of being reclaimed. And now it seems the word homosexual has since garnered negative connotations.
Yeah, and I think that's so much because of legislation based, that's been used against those who identify as homosexual. And so, what's another part to consider there is that's going to be your sexual orientation versus your gender identity or expression. And so this becomes multifaceted layers of holy cow, this is confusing. And so, and that's where it's important to notate that, like, as someone who potentially is transgender, they may not necessarily identify as homosexual. They could still be heterosexual. They have transitioned to a gender not assigned to them at birth, and still be attracted to someone who at that would be an opposite sex of them. So they'd still be heterosexual. They would just not be cisgender.
Well, I'm thinking, so I want to go through just a couple more of the terms that I think we sort of hear more often, likely, or maybe are newly becoming more common, and then go back and sort of look at it again from those two angles of, okay, for people that are in the industry or profession as advisors and planners, which of these should matter to employers? Why should they matter? What information should be gathered and why? And then looking at it from an advisor planner perspective of, hey, this is why you should understand what these are and the financial services implications for them. So, you've mentioned transgender a few times. So if we can get the definition for that from our handy.
Sure. So that's going to be an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex that they were assigned at birth. So being transgender does not, as I mentioned just a moment ago, does not imply any specific sexual orientation. So transgender people can identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. So once again, that's those whose gender identity and or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex that they were assigned at birth.
So then if you hear like a transgender woman, then that would be someone who was born as a male, but identifies as a woman.
That's correct. That's right.
So we'd say probably the most famous modern day representation of that would be Caitlyn Jenner.
That's right. Yeah, that's one that comes to mind probably most often in the United States.
Yeah. And then non-binary.
Mm-hmm. So non-binary is essentially someone who's just like, I don't believe that this is just a binary. Typically someone who is, they're not going to conform to it being male or female. And so I'll read this definition. Is an adjective describing a person who does not exclusively identify as a man or a woman. So non-binary people can identify as both a man or a woman, or somewhere in between, or just completely outside of these categories. And so, this is something that, because there's a phrase oftentimes that gender is a social construct, sex is assigned at birth. And that's like you said before, it's kind of the medical term. Gender is how are we showing up, and are we going to abide by societal norms of what we think that a woman should be or should look like, and what a man should be or should look like. And typically non-binary folks are just those that they may identify as either or nowhere in between. They're like, I don't certainly believe in this.
And having a lot of, or all advisors and planners around the world listening to this, I know the show Billions is played around the world. I was at a conference in Israel last year and talking with people there about how much they love Billions. If you haven't seen it yet, it's both good and infuriating in terms of a look inside Wall Street here in the US. But Taylor Mason, played by Asia Kate Dillon, is a non-binary actor. And so that's a great example there. And I believe in the terminology, and having read through the human rights, the definitions, the Human Rights Campaign definitions, that it's fairly similar in my understanding with gender neutral. And for those that have seen the show, they are referred to as they. It's not, is she coming? Is he coming? It's using a pronoun of they.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's one of those that sometimes it's easier of just, even when you're not necessarily referring to someone as non-binary. So often I see it in kind of older materials of like he or she, and it just using, are they coming? Is this person coming? But yeah, absolutely.
Well, and so going back to that article in the UK, that's what it was. It was, let's just change it to they. That way we're not assuming the person getting the piece of the pension is he or she or man or woman. It doesn't matter. It's they. And we're seeing that more and more, like I mentioned earlier, people putting their pronouns in their email signatures and in their social media profiles. So one of the things that came up in a recent conversation is, how do you appropriately ask someone what their preferred pronouns are?
Probably the way that I would do that if I were at a conference, or at post-COVID-19 conferences of the past, or just meeting someone for the first time, I would say, hi, my name is Cait. My pronouns are she, her, hers. What is your name and what are your preferred pronouns? And the more comfortable you become with that little spiel of asking, telling this is my name, these are mine, what is your name, what are yours? It becomes as natural as just simply saying, hi, my name's Cait, what's yours? And so something that is a really nice byproduct of asking this is that even if there isn't someone in the room that identifies as LGBTQ, there may potentially be someone that is in the room that identifies as LGBTQ and isn't forthcoming with their identity. And at that point, you were signaling to them that, hey, I'm a safe person, or at least a safe or safer person, and I'm inviting you to be yourself with me. So it's a nice byproduct of asking that question.
Yes, that's a great way to be inclusive. And I would love to hear from listeners around the world. I'm seeing this happening more, but I anticipate we're still in the very early stages of, I don't even know how common that is, but in the early stages of that becoming more common.
Yeah. And I'm beginning to see it at conferences in the States of asking or just identifying. It's not every time, but I think it is becoming a bit more common.
Yeah. So circling back, I can see people saying, hey, if I'm hiring people, I don't need to know if they're lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Their sexual preference doesn't, shouldn't have any impact on their work. Are there reasons in hiring within financial services that those questions should be asked?
I think that as long as they're asked with understanding the intention behind why are you asking this, um, if you're asking it as a way to filter out candidates and that you're going to use someone's sexual orientation or gender identity against them, of course, it's probably best to examine one's heart and hiring ethics, from the jump. But a reason that can be beneficial to ask that is because it can actually help someone be their own authentic selves at work. And that's something that, just an example of, most cisgender heterosexual people don't think twice about saying my husband or my wife or my spouse, etc., when they come to work. And our families are such a big part of who we are. And so for someone who may be a part of the LGBTQ community, they may have actually faced discrimination in the past to where they're forced to recloset themselves, or they're forced to not be forthcoming with who they are. And that has impacts. That has impacts on productivity, on retention, on turnover, et cetera. So it has an impact, of course, on your culture, but also on just your bottom line. And I hate to make the business case for diversity, but when you're able to let someone be themselves at work, they kind of sigh that collective sigh of relief. And so they're able to show up more and focus on what matters, which is your business and your clients, versus like, oh, I can't say who I'm with, I can't say what I was doing last night, or my spouse's name, or they can't come to the holiday party, etc. So it becomes a lot of dodging and weaving. So by asking this question, you can essentially allow your employee to breathe a bit easier.
Yeah, and asking in a way that shows that it's a safe place and that it's not being done to weed people out. And hopefully this is a totally unnecessary disclaimer, but just to make sure we get it in there, neither one of us are legal or human resources professionals. So none of this is binding in any way. Every state and country has their own rules on what you can and cannot ask when hiring. So we're just talking about it from a inclusion perspective. And one of the other things that you sent me, Cait, that I've linked to is also from the Human Rights Campaign. And it has some great outlines for how to ask questions on your gender and transgender status and your sexual orientation.
That's right. Yeah, and that's a great resource to reference when you're looking at how do I ask these questions, whether it be internally or externally. So while you're working with your employees or your clients.
Yeah, and then the flip side of that, how can you have that conversation with clients and let them know that it's a safe space? Because everything you just said about being an employee, I would think translates to being a client of, can I share my real identity? And there are a lot of impacts on a client's financial situation. You mentioned earlier, from taxes to estate planning to insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, one of the first things that a financial planning organization can do is show that through imagery on their site. Actually show different individuals, whether it be from different races, different ethnicities, genders, as well as sexual orientation. So I think that's a signal in itself. The next thing is typically by having a diversity statement alongside your mission and vision statement. Especially having a diversity statement is incredibly beneficial to people who are different than potentially the firm owner. So kind of the same way that handicap ramps aren't just beneficial to those who are handicapped, they help people with luggage, or they help moms or dads coming up the ramp with a stroller. These are things that can have unintended positive impacts to your clients and to potential employees. The next thing is outright saying it on your hiring on the ad or on the opportunity itself. And running that through, you can actually run that through different screeners to make sure that you are inclusive. So the positive thing there is you don't have to necessarily get it all right yourself. You can run that through a screener online to see, like, is my wording aggressive, or am I slated to have more candidates of a particular gender, etc. So those are just a few of the things that you can do.
Are those like artificial intelligence tools online?
A little bit, yeah. And
No way.
I'll definitely send a couple of those links to you so you can post them in the show notes.
Yeah, I would love that. Because the other thing I was thinking, and thinking back again to that new model advisor article and just other conversations that I've been having with advisors when it comes to, having more inclusive language, again, whether it's for clients or within the profession, is, like you just said, running your language through things and seeing, do you have those unconscious biases? Does it say, Mr. and Mrs.? Does it say, what's his birthday and what's her birthday, right? All those little things that I think we've just become so accustomed to that we don't actually realize is probably everywhere in our documentation.
And it's so important, because even just changing that to be a drop-down option so that you're not saying it's Mr. or Mrs., that you can choose. Another way of, instead of saying husband or wife, you can just simply say spouse, or individual 1 and individual 2. And part of that also is, if you're not just planning for those who are married, you may be planning for a single parent and their child, if they have a disabled child, or et cetera. So those are also byproducts of making sure that you have more inclusive language in your intake forms and in your data collection, et cetera.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, when you mentioned the handicap ramps and everything, this is part of a broader conversation of making sure that we are inclusive to everyone. So regardless of gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, religion, military or veteran status. And Cait, I know you are a huge advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion across all of those categories and so many others.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, from an intersectional perspective of understanding how each of these identities can interact and work together, of how different people have faced various obstacles in their lives. And so by having a focus on inclusivity, we can have a larger impact in our clients. And we also create space to ask the questions that may not have been asked before. I have clients that I've worked with that, never chose to get married, and finally asked. So I was like, hey, do you guys understand the financial impacts of getting married, of what this can be for you financially, especially in the way of estate? And they had no clue or idea on this. And they have actually worked with a financial planner before. So these things haven't been explained in the past. So it definitely gives room to additional planning opportunities.
So do you have recommendations, I'll say first, for advisors and planners in the profession, for where they can find resources? Knowing that we're talking to a global audience, but how can they, find other people that they can relate to and allies?
Yeah. So, I think my scope is a bit limited, so I apologize to those who are outside of the United States. But I would say first and foremost would be looking to, one of the best resources, in my opinion, is 2050 Trailblazers. I think they do a wonderful job with creating literature and inclusive conversations. Of course, this podcast here. Others would be Quad A, and so that's the African American Advisor Association, and the AFCPE, the Association for Financial Counseling and Planning Education. They do a wonderful job with your DEI initiatives and helping equip financial planners and financial coaches to be more inclusive. And the CFP board, I think that they're doing a really good job, especially in the way of academic research, of equipping planners to serve broader audiences. And then lastly, the FPA, so the Financial Planning Association. I'm a member of the FPA, and I'm definitely a part of different committees and knowledge circles, et cetera. So between those organizations listed, there's a full gamut of resources available that you won't have to recreate the wheel when it comes to finding this knowledge.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to link to all of those because, so often when I travel abroad and I'm talking to other advisors, so many people when it comes to financial planning look to the US because financial planning turned 50 in the US last year. So, pretty far ahead of most other countries. So there's a lot of great stuff happening here in the way of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those are all totally relevant. And I'd love to hear from, listeners around the world if you have great resources in your country or, communities, and how can we connect LGBTQ advisors around the world.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Cait, thank you for allowing me to not know it all, for sharing all that you did with listeners, for even saying that you don't know it all. I think that, really highlights that we are all in this together, that all we can do is everyone just keep doing their best, keep learning, trying, having these conversations. It can feel uncomfortable. I told you before, I was almost more nervous about this than anything because, I don't want to offend or say the wrong thing, but sometimes that's how you learn also.
I think that that's the most important thing is you come into these conversations with an eager mind and heart, and that not to be too cheesy of, as long as we really inspect what is our intention behind this, and we try to come into these conversations with respect and love for others, we'll typically make it to the other side of the conversation with it. It won't be as difficult as we anticipate it to be.
Yeah. Well, thank you for making this an easy conversation. Any final words or thoughts?
No final words or thoughts. I welcome anyone to connect with me. I'm at Cait Howerton on Twitter as well as on LinkedIn. So certainly please connect with me there. And I wish you all the best of luck in your coming ventures.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cait.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Innovating Advice Show. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn and shoot me a thought or two. Link to my profile is right below. Stay safe, stay well, and I look forward to hearing from you.